Well, hello and welcome to this episode of the Dawson's Podcast. I'm Aubrey Dawson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Olivia Whitting from the Outlast Register. Olivia, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's
You're
great to be
welcome.
here.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. So, you are a cultural property specialist at the Outlast Register, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about it and find out a little bit more about this really interesting and quite relevant topic. So, let's start by telling me what exactly is cultural property?
So, cultural property has a kind of quite a wide-ranging lot of descriptions. It sort of is anything that relates to a country or a civilization or a people's kind of own cultural history and background. It's usually not used to refer to sort of Western European art, and it's used to refer to particularly sort of classical antiquities, to anything that comes from civilizations in Africa, countries in Africa, South America, even some sort of communities in North America, and it really sort of is. We sort of use this description, this definition, because it encompasses quite a lot. So, for example, a Greek vase is cultural property in the same way that sort of a pre-Columbian tapestry might also be cultural property. So it's quite wide-ranging and really sort of helps tell the story of a community or a culture's history.
Perfect. So I can see how wide encompassing that would be. If you look at some of the ethnographic art sectors, for example, some of the carvings, as you say, some of the pre-Columbian pottery. Would that extend to sort of maybe Chinese artifacts, Chinese porcelain, jade, etc.?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. That would certainly come under it, and with cultural property, there is that element of sort of being important to its own culture, that is obviously there with Western European art, which is of course very important to all of our own cultures, but sort of due to the sort of Eurocentric, I guess, nature of history of art, cultural property is kind of defined as something separate.
And I think over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen an awful lot of relocation of cultural property back to its original. Particularly if we look at the Chinese market, there's been huge quantities of Chinese porcelain and ivories going back to China. They're buying back their cultural history. We're seeing the same with some of the emerging Indian markets now as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's particularly interesting sort of seeing those countries' sort of wealth increase enormously. For example, countries in the Middle East, the number of very, very wealthy people is going up. And it's interesting to see that they really spend that money on buying back their own sort of cultural property from other countries, from auction houses in across the world, and dealers across the world. And obviously, I think now that a lot of things have gone online, that's sort of easier, because you can buy something from anywhere now, really.
Hmm. And I think that we have seen quite a lot over the last. If you look at cultural property and cultural artifacts, now some of these, when they originally acquired, perhaps by Western countries, they might have been bought, they might have been purchased at the time, but some of them might perhaps have made their way over here by less legal means, should we say?
Certainly, yes. I think particularly that's definitely coming to the fore now, and I think particularly with, I mean, for example, the Benin Bronzes, which were taken from the Kingdom of Benin in modern day Nigeria, in 1897 in the so-called punitive expedition by the British Army. And those items are obviously now in collections all over the world, but their initial move from that country was, in those days, seen as perfectly legitimate, but it still wasn't a legal transaction. But now it's really one of those examples of things that people feel quite strongly should go back. And certainly I'm of the same agreement. I'm of the agreement that it should definitely go back.
Yeah, and I think there's probably a lot of things that fit into those categories. The Elgin marbles, for example, and that's probably a topic for another day. That's quite an interesting one. But I'm quite interested to know how the Art Loss Register works with cultural property. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So with cultural property, we have a team here who, so with the Art Loss Register, we provide due diligence to the art market. So obviously a lot of that is working with auction houses such as yourselves, and checking that everything coming up for auction above a certain threshold sort of is not listed by us as having any prior claims, whether that's something, whether it's been stolen before, whether someone has a sort of partial claim to it, or whether it should be in a museum somewhere abroad or in this country. So that's sort of one part of it. And the part that really focuses on cultural property is sort of working with dealers and auction houses to check cultural property, both against our database, but also to check the provenance of these pieces, because obviously provenance can tell you a huge amount about that item's sort of recent history. And for us, working with cultural property, provenance is hugely important. And so we issue certificates for cultural property that is searched with us, that meets our requirements for not being a sort of problematic piece of cultural property. So that must mean that it has provenance that is sort of verifiable provenance, which dates back to at least the year 2000. Because for us, sort of, we want a chunk of time where we know exactly where that object has been, and we feel that that's a sort of good basis for research, sort of over 20 years. And also we feel that if you have something, you should have provenance if it's cultural property back at least 20 years, because people sort of really started caring about provenance sort of in the 90s or so, when kind of conflicts were starting, things were appearing on the market that were probably illicit, and so provenance became really quite important. And sort of along the same side of that, we have our sort of need for documentation, which for cultural property is hugely important, because each country has their own cultural property laws. So, for example, Egypt banned the trade of antiquities, of Egyptian antiquities, in 1983. So for us, what's really sort of important and means that a piece is probably not going to have any problems associated with it is when we see something that puts a transaction of that piece prior to that date, because we know it was in circulation, it was then out of Egypt, and it was sort of being bought and sold on the open market.
Mm-hmm. So it's all about piecing together the history of pieces and ultimately making sure that something that is being, is being sold, that the person has good title to sell it, and it's not going to come back and by A, the client, and B, by the auction house further down the line.
Exactly, because no one wants to have anything come out sort of about claims, because it's such, it's so difficult for sort of all parties to resolve.
And that's why this due diligence process is so important for us. And I suppose more recently, with some of the things that have been looted from Syria, perhaps that must be even more challenging for you. How would you go about researching some of these things?
Absolutely. So with Syria, I think, so as I mentioned, sort of countries having their own cultural property laws. And um, for us, there's also the fact that obviously the civil war in Syria began in 2011. So we are very, very wary of items that have no provenance prior to 2011 because it would throw up all sorts of issues about where this item was found, how it got out of the country, why suddenly it's appearing in Western Europe with nothing before this conflict. And so it points, a lot of these are sort of red flags. So they point to a possibly illicit excavation, illicit exportation. And so for us, with Syrian pieces in particular, there are certainly quite sort of recognizable features on Syrian objects, particularly from the Roman period. I'm sure lots of people saw I'm sure a lot of people saw the destruction of Palmyra, and pieces from there are very recognizable. And it's very difficult to sell something from Palmyra now that does not have very, very heavily documented provenance. So whether that's a publication depicting the item sort of, during the 20th century, whether it's been in an auction sale sort of prior to that, and sort of really been in the public domain. So for us, it's when we look at those pieces, we're sort of looking at the items themselves and also how it might fit into sort of current trends of the market and its own provenance.
Hmm. So, obviously, Dawson's, we're members of the Outlast Register, and everything that we sell that's worth over £1,000 is checked by your team of specialists to make sure that it's not on the register, it hasn't been recorded as stolen. Now, for some things, that's quite easy because, for a wristwatch, for example, it might have a serial number. But for a carved stone statue, that's a lot harder. How do you go about that?
It is. It's much, yes. Some things obviously have particular numbers or features which are quite easy to search through our database for. Exactly as you say, watches certainly are a lot easier. With cultural property, we always search. We always sort of do a double search, so more than one person will search the database for the item, and it's always a person, so it's not sort of automated, and we are sort of looking into kind of image matching and things like that. So that could be a feature soon, but at the moment we find that actually it's almost better to have an actual person sort of
Hmm.
looking at two items, because of course it might be, we might have a very bad picture on the database that someone could potentially pick out similarities and say, actually, I think this is too similar for us to be able just to rule it out. We're going to contact the victim, contact the searcher to find out if they have more pictures, if there's any provenance information. So really for us, we use the item's description. So we'll look at the item and we will sort of see, okay, if we have a Greek vase in front of us that depicts a specific myth or something like that, we will use words associated with what it actually depicts in order to sort of search the database and try and pick out things like that. Because obviously, I mean, this is not just something that happens with cultural property, but with sort of other art as well. That attributions can change, so we don't always know the artist, and so but what really doesn't change is what the item actually shows, and so that's sort of how we search, and then it will come to one of my team, and we will sort of have a look and see if there's anything, if we have any particularly similar items. That's when it comes to us, and we will sort of try and say for certain whether or not it is a match.
And we've all seen films like Monuments Men, and obviously we know there's an awful lot of property that was looted during the Second World War. How often do you come across things like that?
Very often. I mean, we have a dedicated team who looks into restitution and Nazi looted art, and it sort of definitely varies from sort of places in the world. Certainly in Germany, they have very, very strong laws regarding Nazi looted art, and a lot of the time, if there is a match with anything, people will try and work towards some sort of resolution in the matter, because it definitely, obviously, it stands out in the history of looting and crime as something really abhorrent. And so with that, people do really try to reach some sort of resolution. So with us and Nazi looted art, I mean, I think it's interesting how much is still being found, and how much, you really don't necessarily know what's going to come out about a painting until it's sort of on the market, or until you send it to the Outlast Register, or until you do some research on it, because a lot of these things get handed down within families, and they may have been sort of remembered in a certain collection for a very long time, but actually it's sort of how that actually came into those collections that may pose a problem.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll still be finding things for decades to come as well.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really is so fascinating. Can you share with us some exciting examples of things that you found with the Art Loss Register?
Sure, absolutely. I think the one that stands out to me, because it was sort of one of my first experiences of finding any cultural property, was in 2019, when, as part of a routine search on an antiquity sale in one of our subscribing auction houses, we came across a piece that was remarkably similar to a piece on our database, that had been registered. We call it a sort of positive registration, and this is slightly different to a registration of something that's been lost or stolen, because a positive registration it can be a piece that is in someone's collection, and they want to sort of have some way of keeping track of where their piece is, and if they have a big collection, then they want to know if somehow it's being sold and they don't know about it, then we can sort of alert them to that fact. But also positive registrations, we use them for cultural property, for our cultural heritage at risk database, which is called CHARD. And we use it because when we register something with CHARD, it means that it should be somewhere, but it may be in danger of being moved, lost, traded. So an example of this would be the recent war in Ukraine. We've registered quite a lot of Ukrainian heritage because, obviously, with conflict, along with the sort of humanitarian issues, cultural property and art is also often at risk as well. And so Chard sort of really encompasses our cultural heritage that's at risk. So to go back to this example, this piece had been registered in 2018 when we had got the full details of the collection of the Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul. And we were registering everything that was in their collection because it was at risk. We wanted to know if anything ever came up on the market, then we would be able to sort of pinpoint exactly where it should be and help it be returned. And so this piece was flagged in one of our auction house clients, and they were brilliant. You know, we sort of were pretty sure it was a match. We went to the British Museum to just check with them that these two photographs could be the same thing, and they were really helpful and said, absolutely, this is it. We can contact the Museum of Afghanistan and sort of try and facilitate it that way, because they have obviously a lot of contacts with other museums. And the auction house pulled it straight away, and their consignor had no idea about any of its provenance, because it had been sort of in an old collection. And so it turned out, once we'd spoken to the Museum of Afghanistan, that this piece had been in their collection. But then in the 90s, during all of that upheaval, it had been sort of taken out of the country somehow, kind of bought and sold, and then ended up in the UK. So I think for me, that was a particularly exciting sort of return, because it also was quite bittersweet, because sort of about 2 years after this return of this cultural object, Afghanistan was once again under the rule of the Taliban, who do not have a good track record in protecting cultural heritage. So it for me, it sort of demonstrates the nature of the differing nature of this, where things should go back, and it's not our place to stop them going back, but you still are not sure what will happen to it once it does return.
Yeah, and if they're at risk of being damaged or destroyed, or going missing again, then it
Yeah.
it does pose some ethical questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, Olivia, I think that's really, really interesting. I think our listeners are going to love hearing you, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great. I really, really enjoyed myself. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.